I'm a construction foreman. My job isn't glamorous, but it's solid work that pays the bills and keeps me grounded. It's the kind of work that's straightforward, you put in the effort, and you see the results. My wife, on the other hand, has a more creative job as a graphic designer. It's not a field I fully understand, but I respect it. She often jokes about how we're opposites in our work lives, her in the world of color and creativity, and me in the world of measurements and deadlines. That balance, I've always thought, worked for us. It kept things interesting without stepping on each other's toes. One evening, we had plans to meet some friends at a bar we all liked. It wasn't a flashy place, but it had a charm of its own. Nestled in a small alleyway, the bar was an open-air setup with string lights hanging overhead and a relaxed atmosphere that made it a favorite for our group. My wife and I ended up running late that night. She's always got one more thing to finish before we leave, and I've gotten used to waiting. By the time we arrived, the group was already deep in a heated discussion. As soon as we got there, I could tell something serious was being debated. I asked what was going on, and someone explained that one of our mutual friends, a woman I didn't know well but had seen around, had decided to try an open relationship. That sparked a strong debate within the group. The room seemed split between those who thought it was progressive and those who thought it was nonsense. Naturally, I had no problem stating my opinion. To me, the whole idea seemed ridiculous. I made it clear that I believed open relationships were just a fancy way to dress up infidelity. It didn't matter how anyone tried to justify it, sharing your partner with someone else was crossing a line in my book. Some people nodded in agreement, but others, including my wife, took a softer stance. She didn't outright defend the friend but suggested that people should be free to make their own choices without judgment. That irked me a little. It felt like she was trying to justify something I saw as fundamentally wrong. The conversation went back and forth for a while. Everyone had their say, and the mood shifted between serious and light-hearted. Eventually, someone changed the subject, and the tension eased. It wasn't worth fighting over all night, but I couldn't help wondering what my wife really thought about it. She's usually on the same page with me about big things, so seeing her take a more neutral stance was something I tucked away in the back of my mind. As the evening wore on, the topic shifted to work. Since most of the group were friends from my wife's job, they started talking about an upcoming company event. Apparently, her department was hosting a corporate party, and they'd invited people from nearby departments as well. I wasn't thrilled about the idea. Her company's office culture had never sat well with me. Without naming names, let's just say that some of their attitudes and values didn't align with mine. It wasn't long before people started heading home. I asked my wife if she planned to attend the corporate party, hoping she'd say no. I wasn't keen on her being around those people, especially the ones from the other departments. I didn't trust them, and I've always been protective of her, maybe more than she'd like. She's independent, sure, but I've got my boundaries, and I don't think that's a bad thing. To my surprise, she said she wanted to go. She explained that she was excited to meet new people and learn more about the other teams. It'll be fun, she said. I didn't push back at the moment, but something about it didn't sit right with me. For now, I decided to let it go, but in the back of my mind, I knew this wasn't the end of the conversation. Later that evening, when we got home, I decided to bring up the earlier conversation from the bar. It wasn't something I could just let slide without asking about. As we settled in, I asked her why she defended that friend. Do you really think open relationships make any sense? Or do you think she's just trying to justify cheating? Maybe her boyfriend is too weak to stand up for himself, I said. I wasn't trying to pick a fight, but I wanted an honest answer. She looked at me calmly and shrugged. I wouldn't try it myself, she said, but it's not about us, is it? Some people live like that. If you hear about it so often, it must be popular in certain circles. Maybe it works for them. Her tone was neutral, almost dismissive, but her words didn't sit well with me. I'm not the type to overthink things, but I couldn't help wondering why she'd even entertain the idea as something valid. But don't get me wrong, she added quickly, probably noticing the look on my face. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just saying it's out there. And sure, it probably feels freeing for some people to have that kind of arrangement while still being close to someone. But again, that's not for me. Don't start overthinking this, okay? Her words were clear, but something about the way she spoke felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I decided not to press further. Sometimes it's better to let things rest. All right, I said, leaning back on the couch. As long as you're not seriously considering it, I'm fine. It just seems like a messy way to live. I tried to push the topic out of my head, but it lingered in the background. I've always been straightforward, and the concept of complicating relationships like that didn't make sense to me. Still, I took her at her word and decided to move on. After a pause, she changed the subject. By the way, she started, do you remember my sister from Austria? It took me a second to place her. We hadn't seen each other in years, but I nodded. She's coming to visit next week, she continued. She'll probably stay for about a week or so. It'll be nice to have her here for a bit. That caught me off guard. Her sister and I had never been particularly close. Not because of any bad blood, but just because we'd never had much reason to interact. What's bringing her here? I asked. Is it just a casual visit, or is something going on? She's dealing with some issues back home with her parents, my wife explained. She didn't get into the details, but it sounds like she needs a break. She'll be staying with us for a while to clear her head. And I'd appreciate it if you didn't pry too much. She'll talk about it if she feels like it. Her tone was firm but kind, and I could tell she wanted me to let the matter be. I shrugged. All right, that's fine. If she needs a place to stay and you're okay with it, I'm okay with it too. We'll make it work. I didn't mind having a guest in the house, as long as it didn't turn into some long-term arrangement. For now, though, I had no reason to push back, so I let the conversation end there. The night of the corporate event arrived, and my wife was getting ready with her usual attention to detail. I watched her from the couch, scrolling through my phone. Before she left, I told her, make sure to check in with me, all right? At least a quick text every hour or so. She rolled her eyes but smiled. Sure, I'll let you know how it's going, she said, giving me a quick peck on the cheek before heading out the door. I wasn't thrilled about the event, but I trusted her to stick to her word. After she left, I settled in with my phone. As I scrolled through a group chat with some of the guys, a familiar name popped up. They were talking about that woman who had decided to try an open relationship. Turns out, she worked in one of the departments involved in tonight's corporate event. The chat was buzzing with opinions, and most of them weren't flattering. Words like justifying cheating and attention seeker were thrown around. It didn't surprise me. Her reputation wasn't exactly stellar, and people didn't hold back when it came to sharing their thoughts. Reading those messages made me think about my wife being at the same event. I couldn't help but wonder if she'd end up talking to that woman. Not that I'd expect anything to come of it, but the idea of her mingling with people I didn't trust didn't sit well with me. I shook it off, reminding myself that she said she'd check in. That would be enough to keep my mind at ease, or so I thought. An hour passed, then another. I realized I hadn't heard from her. I glanced at my phone, expecting to see a message, but there was nothing. I decided to call her. The phone rang a few times before going to voicemail. That's when the irritation started creeping in. She'd promised to keep in touch, and now she wasn't picking up. I tried to convince myself that she was probably busy or had left her phone in her bag. Still, it didn't do much to calm my nerves. Figuring there was no point in sitting around stewing, I called a few friends and invited them over to watch the game. If she wasn't going to check in, I might as well enjoy the evening. The guy showed up, and for a while, I was able to push the situation out of my mind. We watched the game, cracked open a few beers, and talked about everything except my wife's silence. But even after they left, the house felt empty, and the clock kept ticking. By now, it was late. Too late for someone who said they'd keep me updated. My patience was running thin, and I started pacing around the living room. Just as I was about to call her again, I heard the front door open. She walked in, looking surprisingly composed. "You're late," I said, my voice edged with frustration. She didn't seem fazed. "I know." "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "We met some great people tonight. A few of them are new to the city, so we decided to show them around a bit. That's why I lost track of time." Her explanation was calm and matter-of-fact, but it didn't erase my irritation. At least she wasn't drunk, which was something I'd half expected. "Look, I'll tell you all about it tomorrow," she added, clearly trying to wind down the conversation. She gave me a quick kiss goodnight before heading upstairs. Reluctantly, I followed. I had plenty of questions, but they would have to wait. For now, we both went to bed, and I tried to push the evening out of my mind. The next morning, as we sat at the kitchen table with coffee in hand, I decided to ask her about the previous night. "Why didn't you pick up when I called?" I said, trying to keep my tone calm but firm. She looked up from her mug, slightly startled but not defensive. "Oh, that," she said. "I'm sorry. My phone was in my bag the whole time. I didn't hear it ring." She shrugged like it wasn't a big deal. "We were just walking around, talking. It wasn't anything crazy." Her explanation didn't fully satisfy me, but I decided to hear her out. "And who were you with, exactly?" I pressed. She set her cup down and started explaining. "I actually met that woman everyone's been talking about," she said, referring to the one who had opened her relationship. "She's not at all like the rumors make her out to be." She told me the whole story, and apparently, it was her boyfriend's idea in the first place. They both agreed to it, so it's not like she's just out there cheating. I frowned. "You know the guys and I were talking about her too, right? We've heard she's been with half the office, and there's plenty of proof to back it up." She shook her head, looking unimpressed. "That's all nonsense," she said firmly. "People love to exaggerate and spread rumors." She seemed genuine to me, not like some drama queen trying to justify bad behavior. Honestly, I think she's just misunderstood. Her defense of this woman irritated me. "I don't think you should be hanging around her," I said plainly. "People like that have a way of pulling others into their mess, even if it's unintentional." She rolled her eyes, and I could tell she was getting annoyed. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "If I wanted to pull something like that, as you put it, I would have done it a long time ago. But I haven't, because I don't want to. Can you trust me on that?" Her irritation was starting to wear on me, but I decided to back off. "Fine," I said, waving a hand dismissively. "Just be careful. People like that can influence you without you even realizing it. That's all I'm saying." She didn't respond, instead taking another sip of her coffee and staring out the window. It was clear we weren't going to agree on this one. Before the tension could linger, she changed the subject. "Anyway," she said, "my sister is coming tomorrow." That caught my attention. "Already?" I asked. "I thought we had more time to get things ready." She shook her head. "Nope, she'll be here tomorrow. So, we need to make sure the guest room is sorted and everything looks nice." I sighed, mentally running through the list of things that needed to be done. It wasn't a huge task, but it wasn't nothing either. "All right," I said. "Let's get it done tonight. I'll take care of the heavy lifting." She nodded, seemingly relieved that the conversation had shifted to something more practical. With that, the mood lightened slightly. We finished our coffee and started planning the rest of the day, focusing on getting the house ready for her sister's arrival. As much as the earlier conversation lingered in my mind, I decided to let it go for now. There were more pressing things to take care of, and the last thing I needed was another argument before her sister even got here. Her sister arrived the next day, just as my wife had said. As soon as she walked through the door, there was a flurry of hugs and greetings. I stood to the side for a moment, letting the two of them have their reunion before stepping in to say hello. Her sister looked tired but relieved, and I could tell that being here meant a lot to her. After the initial excitement settled, we all moved to the dining table, where my wife had already set out some snacks and coffee. While my wife and her sister caught up, I helped bring her luggage upstairs to the guest room. Once everything was set down, I asked her if she needed anything else. She shook her head and said, "No, this is perfect. Thank you." We started chatting casually as she unpacked, and that's when she brought it up herself. "I really appreciate you letting me stay here for a while," she said, her tone sincere. "It's been tough lately with my parents." I paused for a moment before replying. "If you don't mind me asking, what happened?" I figured that if she was opening the door to this topic, it wouldn't hurt to ask. She sighed, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "It's not a secret," she said. "I'm a lesbian. I came out to them recently, and they didn't take it well. Actually, they didn't take it at all. It turned into a massive argument, and things have been pretty bad ever since. I needed some space to clear my head, so I decided to come here." I nodded, taking it all in. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "But for what it's worth, you're welcome here for as long as you need. Family's supposed to have your back, even when they don't agree with everything." She smiled faintly and said, "Thanks. That means a lot." It wasn't much, but I could tell it helped to hear someone say it. When we came back downstairs, my wife was already making plans. "I was thinking," she said, "we could spend some time exploring the city. I have this new friend who knows all the best spots. She's been raving about this little coffee shop and some great local markets. It'll be fun." Her sister seemed excited about the idea, and I didn't see any harm in it, so I just nodded along. They deserved some time to relax, especially after everything her sister had been through. Not long after, my phone buzzed. It was my father. "We've got a problem with the shed," he said, sounding stressed. "The structure's giving out, and it's about to collapse on the fence. I need your help to take it down before it causes more damage." I sighed, knowing this wasn't something I could put off. When my dad called for help, it was always urgent. I explained the situation to my wife and her sister. "Looks like I'll be heading out to help my dad," I said. "You two go ahead with your plans. Explore the city, have a good time. Just keep me posted on where you're going." My wife nodded, understanding the urgency. "Of course," she said. "We'll manage. Don't worry about us." It wasn't how I'd planned to spend the day, but priorities are priorities. I grabbed my things, gave my wife a quick kiss, and headed out the door. As I left, I glanced back to see the two of them chatting animatedly about their itinerary. It was good to see her sister smiling again, even if it meant I'd miss out on the day with them. After hours of hard work helping my father dismantle the shed, I was exhausted but satisfied with the progress we'd made. The structure had been a disaster waiting to happen, and while we hadn't finished the job entirely, we'd at least managed to stabilize things and prevent any immediate damage. It was one of those days where physical labor cleared my mind, and I was looking forward to heading home, taking a shower, and relaxing. When I walked through the door, however, my plans for a quiet evening vanished immediately. Sitting in the living room were my wife, her sister, and two guests I recognized instantly, my wife's new friend and her boyfriend. The pair struck an odd image. Their clothes were flashy, almost costume-like, and their whole vibe screamed attention seekers. I nodded a polite hello, though inwardly I was already bracing myself for what was to come. I joined them in the living room, grabbing a drink from the kitchen on the way. The atmosphere was casual, but it didn't take long before the conversation shifted into familiar territory. The friend and her boyfriend were once again singing the praises of open relationships, going on about how freeing and transformative they were. They spoke with a missionary zeal, as if trying to convert everyone in the room to their way of thinking. I listened for a while, trying to keep my patience. Eventually, I'd had enough. "Look," I said, cutting into their monologue. "You can talk it up all you want, but to me, it's just an excuse for people who can't commit. Relationships aren't supposed to be a free-for-all. If you can't stick with one person, maybe you shouldn't be in a relationship at all." My tone was firm but calm, though I could see their expressions change immediately. The boyfriend shot back, "That's such a closed-minded way of looking at it. People are different, and relationships don't have to fit into some outdated mold. Maybe you should try thinking outside the box." His condescension grated on me, but I stayed composed. "Thinking outside the box doesn't mean throwing away basic respect and commitment," I replied. "If you want to live your life that way, fine, but don't act like it's some universal truth everyone else should follow." The argument escalated quickly from there. Voices were raised, points were repeated, and the tension in the room became unbearable. My wife and her sister tried to mediate, but it was clear that this wasn't going to end with anyone changing their minds. Eventually, the couple stood up, clearly frustrated. "Well, it's obvious you're not ready to have an open mind about this," the friend said, grabbing her bag. "Thanks for the evening, but we'll be going now." Her boyfriend followed suit, and just like that, they were gone. As the door closed behind them, I felt a mix of relief and lingering frustration. Before I could even sit down, my wife pulled me aside. "What was that?" she demanded, her voice low but sharp. "Why couldn't you just let it go? You didn't have to turn it into a fight." I looked at her, trying to keep my own temper in check. "I'm not going to sit here and listen to that nonsense without saying something," I said. "If they can't handle a different opinion, that's their problem, not mine." She sighed, clearly exasperated. "It's not about agreeing with them," she said. "It's about keeping the peace." Now they're upset, and honestly, I'm upset too. You can't just banish everyone who doesn't think exactly like you. Her words stung, but I stood my ground. "I'm not banishing anyone," I said. "But I am saying I don't want you hanging around people like that. They're a bad influence, and you know it. The company you keep matters, whether you like it or not." That was the last straw for her. "You don't get to dictate who I'm friends with," she snapped. "I don't tell you who you can or can't spend time with, so don't try to control me." With that, she stormed off to the bedroom, leaving me standing there in the living room. I took a deep breath, realizing there was no point in continuing the argument tonight. Eventually, I followed her upstairs. Neither of us said another word as we got ready for bed, and the silence hung heavy between us as we turned out the lights and went to sleep. The morning started unusually quiet. When I woke up, the house was empty, which wasn't something I was used to. Normally, there was some movement, some noise from the kitchen, or at least a light on in the living room. Instead, I found only a note from my wife. It was short and to the point: "We went to the mall. Be back later." Though we obviously referred to her and her sister. I shrugged it off initially. It wasn't strange for them to spend time together, especially since her sister was visiting. As the hours passed, I waited for them to come back. When they finally arrived, it didn't take long to notice something was off. Her sister looked visibly upset. She wasn't crying or making a scene, but her mood was unmistakably low. I asked her if everything was all right, but she just waved me off with a faint smile and a mumbled "I'm fine." That might have been enough to convince someone else, but not me. Something was bothering her, and she wasn't saying what. This pattern repeated itself over the next few days. They would leave together, always giving vague explanations about where they were going, and return hours later. Every time, her sister's demeanor seemed worse. She became quieter, more withdrawn. I tried asking her again, but she gave me the same dismissive response. "Nothing," she'd say, avoiding eye contact. My wife, on the other hand, acted like nothing was out of the ordinary. If anything, she seemed more animated than usual, chatting away about their outings as if nothing was wrong. By the fourth day, my patience was wearing thin. I'm not the kind of guy to jump to conclusions or get paranoid, but there was something undeniably strange about the whole situation. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something from me. It wasn't just her sister's behavior, it was the evasive way my wife avoided giving me straight answers about their plans. Every explanation felt rehearsed, like she'd prepared just enough to keep me from asking more questions. I started paying closer attention to their movements, hoping to pick up on anything that might explain what was going on. Each time they left the house, I'd ask casual questions about where they were going and what they planned to do. My wife would answer quickly and confidently, but her sister's silence spoke volumes. It was clear she wasn't comfortable, but I couldn't tell if it was because of me or something else entirely. On the 5th day, after another round of vague excuses and a particularly tense return home, I decided I'd had enough. There was only one way to get to the bottom of this. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them by asking directly. My wife's laptop seemed like the most logical place to start. She used it for everything, from work to personal messages, so if there was anything to find, it would be there. Of course, I wasn't about to do something like that while she was around. It would have to wait until she left for work. She usually took her phone with her, but the laptop stayed at home most of the time. That gave me a window of opportunity. I didn't feel great about the idea of snooping, but the constant secrecy was getting to me. I needed to know what was going on, and if this was the only way to find out, so be it. By the time the day ended, I had a plan. I'd wait for her to leave in the morning, make sure her sister was occupied, and then check the laptop. If there was nothing, I'd drop it and move on. But if there was something, at least I'd finally have some clarity. For now, all I could do was wait and hope that whatever I found wouldn't make things worse. The morning started quietly. My wife had already left for work, and her sister was still asleep upstairs. It was the perfect moment to put my plan into action. I sat at the dining table, opened her laptop, and steeled myself for what I might find. I wasn't proud of resorting to this, but the constant secrecy had left me with no choice. I navigated to her messaging app and started scrolling through her recent conversations. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary: work messages, a few casual chats with friends. But then I found the thread with her new friend. My gut told me to focus there, and within moments, I knew I'd struck something significant. Their conversation was casual at first, filled with emojis and light banter, but the tone shifted quickly. They were discussing open relationships again, and my wife was more enthusiastic than I'd expected. It's such a freeing concept, she'd written. Honestly, I think it's something every couple should consider. As I read further, my stomach tightened. She had written that she'd met someone. It's nothing serious, she'd said, but it feels amazing to have that kind of freedom. She went on to say that she planned to talk to me about opening our marriage that very evening. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just a passing thought or a hypothetical conversation. She was serious, and she'd already crossed a line without saying a word to me. What angered me even more was the way they talked about her sister. Between discussing their so-called freedom, they made jokes at her expense. "She's so uptight," one message read. "I don't know how she'll ever survive without loosening up a bit." Another comment implied that her sister's issues with their parents were somehow her own fault. Reading those messages made my blood boil. Here was someone who had come to us for support, and instead of standing by her, my wife had been mocking her behind her back. I closed the laptop, my mind racing. My wife's behavior was one thing, but the way she'd treated her own sister was something else entirely. It explained so much about why her sister had been so withdrawn lately. She'd already faced rejection from their parents, and now she had to deal with this kind of treatment under our roof. I couldn't let it slide. I went upstairs and gently knocked on her sister's door. When she opened it, she looked groggy but managed a faint smile. "Can we talk for a minute?" I asked. She nodded and sat down on the edge of the bed. I didn't beat around the bush. "Is this about why you've been upset lately?" I asked. "Is it because of what's been said behind your back?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like she might deny it. But then she sighed and nodded. "It's not just that," she said quietly. "I've felt like I don't matter for a long time. First with our parents, and now even here. I thought coming here would be different, but," she trailed off, looking away. Her words hit me hard. This wasn't just about the messages, it was about a deeper sense of alienation and neglect. I decided to tell her everything. I explained what I'd found, sparing no details. Her expression shifted from hurt to anger as I spoke. When I finished, I proposed an idea. If she wants an open marriage, I said, let's give her one. But on our terms. I laid out a plan that would make her see the consequences of her choices. To my surprise, her sister didn't hesitate. If that's what it takes to make her understand, I'm in, she said. Her resolve was clear, and for the first time in days, she looked like she had some fight left in her. We talked late into the morning, hashing out the details over coffee and, eventually, a couple of drinks. By the time we were done, we had a plan, and her sister seemed more at ease. I didn't know how this would play out, but one thing was certain, things were about to change in this house, and not on my wife's terms. It was early evening when I heard the sound of the front door slamming shut. My wife's voice echoed through the house before I even saw her. "We need to talk," she shouted, her tone sharp and commanding. I stayed where I was, upstairs in the bedroom, taking my time to respond. "Come up if you want to talk," I called back, my voice calm but deliberate. There was no urgency in my tone, and I knew that would only fuel her temper further. The sound of her heels clacking against the stairs filled the silence as she stormed up to the bedroom. Her determination was written all over her face when she appeared in the doorway. "I've made a decision," she began without preamble, her hands on her hips. "We're opening our marriage, and that's final. I'm tired of living by these outdated rules. I'm a strong, independent woman, and I refuse to be held back any longer." She spoke with the confidence of someone who expected no resistance. "Oh, is that right?" I said, my tone still even, as I leaned back against the headboard. "Why don't you come in and we can discuss it properly?" There was no hint of agitation in my voice, and I knew she wouldn't immediately catch on to the trap she was walking into. She stepped fully into the room, clearly ready to launch into another monologue, when her eyes landed on the scene before her. Her sister was kneeling in front of me, clearly engaged in something intimate. Her face twisted in disbelief, and for a moment, she was too stunned to speak. Then the reality hit her, and the explosion came. "What the hell is this?" she screamed, her voice breaking. Her shock quickly turned into fury as she pointed an accusing finger at me. "How dare you? How could you do this to me?" I didn't move from my spot. "You wanted an open marriage," I said calmly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "This is what it looks like. Or did you think it was only going to go one way? That you could have your freedom while I stayed here waiting for you?" My words were measured, deliberate, and each one seemed to push her closer to the edge. "This isn't what I meant," she yelled, her voice cracking. "You're disgusting. An open marriage doesn't mean you can just..." She gestured wildly toward her sister, unable to finish the sentence. "This is betrayal. Absolute betrayal." Her hypocrisy was almost laughable, but I wasn't in the mood to laugh. "You made your choice," I said, cutting her off. "You decided to bring someone else into our marriage without even talking to me first. You thought you could just dictate the terms and expect me to fall in line. Well, congratulations, you got what you wanted. But you don't get to cry about it now." I stood up, my voice rising just enough to make it clear that I was done entertaining her theatrics. "You wanted freedom. Now you have it. Enjoy it somewhere else." She stared at me, her face a mix of rage and disbelief, before turning on her heel and storming out. The sound of her stomping down the stairs and slamming the front door behind her echoed through the house. I stood there for a moment, the silence settling in after her departure. Her sister remained where she was, unbothered by the commotion, and I leaned back, letting the tension drain from the room. She'd made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of control returning, even if the situation was far from resolved. After the explosive confrontation, the house was finally quiet again. I turned to her sister, who was still composed despite everything that had just unfolded. "Thanks for having my back," I said, meaning it. It wasn't the kind of situation anyone would willingly walk into, and yet, she hadn't hesitated. Her support in that moment meant more than I could put into words. She gave a small shrug and a faint smile. "It's no problem," she said. "Honestly, this whole thing has made me think about a lot of things in my own life. Maybe it's time for me to stop holding back and start being honest about what I want, too." Her words carried a weight that I didn't miss. It was clear that she wasn't just talking about the events of the evening, but about deeper issues she'd been grappling with for a long time. As the reality of what had just happened settled in, I knew there was no going back. I needed to make a decision, and I'd already made it. While my wife's betrayal had been the final straw, it was clear that the cracks in our marriage had been forming long before this. There was no sense in dragging it out any longer. I started gathering her things, methodically going through the house and collecting everything that belonged to her. Clothes, shoes, books, and anything else I could find. I didn't rush, taking the time to make sure I didn't miss anything. As I worked, her sister stayed nearby, occasionally helping when I asked, but mostly just keeping me company. We talked as I packed, and the conversation turned to their past. "You know," she began hesitantly, "she's always been like this. Self-centered, manipulative. Even when we were kids, she'd find ways to make everything about her. If I ever tried to stand up for myself, she'd just tear me down until I gave up." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of pain that she couldn't quite hide. Hearing that didn't surprise me, but it did add another layer to the situation. "So, she bullied you?" I asked, glancing over as I folded another shirt into a box. Her sister nodded. "Yeah, but I didn't really think of it that way at the time. I just dealt with it. It's not like our parents did anything about it, and after a while, I just stopped reacting. I guess she took that as a green light to keep going." I shook my head, disgusted but not shocked. "Well, she's not going to be my problem anymore," I said firmly. "You don't deserve that, and neither do I. She's made her choices, and now she gets to live with them." Her sister gave me a small nod, her expression unreadable but contemplative. It was clear that she had a lot to process, just like I did. By the time I finished packing, there were several bags and boxes stacked neatly by the door. Each one felt like a small weight lifted off my shoulders. I took a deep breath, stepping back to look at the pile. It was a tangible reminder that I was taking control of the situation, that I wasn't going to let her dictate the terms of my life any longer. With everything in place, I opened the door and moved the bags and boxes outside. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a sense of resolution. She'd made her decisions, and now she would have to face the consequences of them. Once the last box was set down by the door, I turned and walked back inside, closing the door behind me. For the first time in